Story number 1. The ranger only asked us one question before we led us onto the trail, and for years I told myself it didn't mean anything. "You boys planning on staying past the ridge line after dark?" We said no. We were lying, though we didn't know it yet. Sometimes the trail decides these things for you. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that 3 of us went into the Kellerman Wilderness the last week of September, and only 2 of us came back able to explain what happened. I've spent 4 years deciding whether to tell this. I'm telling it now because I don't think staying quiet protected anyone. Since college, nothing serious, weekend trips, easy summits, the kind of hiking where you complain about your knees and eat too many trail mix bars. Kellerman was supposed to be a step up, 22 miles, a loop trail that dipped through old-growth hemlock before climbing to a decommissioned fire lookout that hadn't been staffed since the 70s. Derek found it on some forum for abandoned structures. He had a thing for places nobody used anymore. The first day was normal. I want to be honest about that, because horror stories always skip the normal part like it doesn't matter. And it does. It matters because it's the last time you set up camp near a creek that ran fast and cold over gray stone, and Sam caught 2 trout he was way too proud of. We laughed. We told the kind of stories you tell around a fire. Stories that are supposed to be scary but are really just an excuse to not the kind that keeps people away. It was the kind of reputation that draws them in. 140 square miles of old hemlock and granite that hadn't seen a real logging operation since before any of our grandparents were born, threaded through with trails that dated back to a civilian conservation corps crew in the 30s. The kind of place where you could walk for 2 days and not cross another hiker's boot print. Derek loved that. He said the modern world had gotten too good at filling silence, and he wanted to know that the forest had a particular quality of light to it, greenish and thick. The sun filtered so many times through hemlock canopy that it arrived at the ground looking tired, used up. Sam joked that it felt like walking through the bottom of an aquarium. None of us thought much of the comment at the time. I think about it constantly now. It was somewhere around 10 that Derek stopped mid-sentence. "You hear that?" We hadn't, then we did. Footsteps, not close, 30, 40 yards out, past the tree line where our fire didn't reach. Slow, deliberate. The kind of walk that isn't trying to be quiet and isn't trying to be loud either. Just walking. But deer don't walk in twos. 2 feet, evenly spaced weight, settling the way a person's weight settles. We didn't sleep well. In the morning, none of us mentioned it, and I think that not mentioning it was its own kind of admission. That was the last easy day. By the second afternoon, the trail started doing something I still don't have a clean word for. Wrong is close. We passed a rock formation shaped like a broken tooth. Derek took a photo of it, said it'd make a good marker, and 90 minutes later, we passed it again. Same rock, same broken tooth shape, same moss pattern on the north face. We'd been walking in a straight line the whole time, Sam said. But the trail didn't loop. Not according to the map. Not according to 3 years of us reading maps together. Derek got quiet in a way that wasn't like him. Derek was the one who made jokes when things got tense. He didn't make one then. We made camp early, closer together than the site called for, and that night the forest went silent in a way I'd never experienced. No insects, no wind moving branches, no distant birds settling for the night. Just the fire, snapping too loud and I noticed the water. The creek we'd camped beside, a different creek than the first night's, wider, slower, had gone still. Not frozen, not blocked, just still. The surface glassy and unmoving in a way that made no sense for a current that had been audible 20 minutes earlier. Derek waded a boot into the shallows to check, and the water resumed moving the moment his boot broke the surface, as if it had only been waiting for something to react to. None of us slept before midnight. I lay in my bag, listening to Derek's breathing beside me, counting it the way you count a stranger's breathing on a plane. 2 notes, low and rising, the kind of sound a person makes to signal another person. We didn't answer it. None of us said what we were thinking, which was, what if it wasn't calling to us? What if it was calling to something else, telling it where we were? It came again 40 minutes later from a different direction. Closer, and a 3rd time near dawn, close enough that I felt Derek go rigid beside me. Close enough that whatever made it could have counted the 3 shapes of art where most people would have turned back. And I need you to understand why we didn't. It wasn't bravery. It was Sam's ankle. He'd rolled it that afternoon on a route we never should have missed. And by nightfall, it had swollen to something ugly and shining under his sock. 6 miles back the way we came, or 4 miles forward to the fire lookout where we knew, because Derek had researched every inch of this trip, there was a locked emergency cache with a satellite. Radio 4 miles 1, it always would have. The third day, there were a dry creek bed. Bare feet, but too long. The toes fused together in the print like there weren't really toes at all. Just a single ridge. The stride between prints was almost 7 feet. Derek, who'd done 4 years of wilderness EMT training and didn't scare easy, crouched over them for a long time without saying anything. Could be an old bear track, distorted by mud settling, he finally said. None of us believed. The forest kept its silence, but now it was a silence with texture, a silence that felt like held breath. Twice, I caught movement at the edge of my vision, not an animal's movement, not the low, quick dart of something small, but tall movement, upright. Gone before I could turn my head fully toward it. Around noon, we found a second set of tracks, smaller, crossing the first at an angle, the stride shorter, but still wrong in the same fused, toeless way. 2 of them, Derek said quietly, like that was somehow better than 1. It wasn't. A pair meant coordination. A pair meant the whistling wasn't a warning around then, not because we'd decided against it, but because none of us could agree which direction led away from whatever was tracking us and which heered toward it. The map said one thing. The compass agreed with the map. Neither of those facts made the forest feel any less like it had rearranged itself specifically to keep us inside it. By late afternoon, Sam started talking about someone standing at the edge of camp the night before. Not a dream, he insisted. He'd woken up because he felt watched. You know that feeling. The one that pulls you out of sleep before your ears even catch the sound. And there'd been a shape at the tree line. Tall, very still, watching the tent. Not moving. I, who saw a shadow and panicked. Now, with the tracks, with the whistling, with the rock we'd passed twice, he didn't feel like the paranoid must push. Derek stopped us with a raised hand and pointed toward a stand of hemlock, maybe 60 yards off trail. At first, I saw nothing but shadow and green. Then the shadow resolved into shape, tall, still, upright between 2 trunks in a way no trunk or stump could account for. Gone the instant I tried to focus on it directly, the way certain stars only appear at the edge of your vision and vanish the moment you look straight at them. None of us said the word we were all thinking. Derek just adjusted his pace, and we didn't stop again until the lookout came into view. We reached weathered timber 40 feet up. A small square cabin with windows on all sides, most of the glass long gone or clouded with grime. The stairs leading up were missing 2 treads near the top, and the whole structure groaned faintly with the wind, the kind of groan that made you understand why people once feared the sound of houses. Settling. The emergency cache was supposed to be bolted beneath the cabin floor. A steel box, according to Derek's research, containing a radio, flares, basic supplies. We climbed. The stairs held. Inside, dust and old leaves and a floor gone soft with rot in one corner. But it was shelter, and shelter his notes said it would be, bolted into the floor joists beneath a loose panel. The lock was old, rusted, and it took him 20 minutes with a multi-tool to force it. Inside, a radio with a dead battery, 3 flares, a first aid kit gone brittle with age, and a logbook. Most of it was unremarkable. Temperature readings, wind speed, notes about a family of pine martens that had denned under the porch 2 winters running. Reading a stranger's mundane observations should have been comforting. Instead, it made the silence outside feel worse, because whoever wrote those entries had once sat exactly where we sat, thinking this place was ordinary right up until it wasn't. The last entry was from 11 years prior, a ranger's handwriting clipped and professional times than I should admit, trying to make it mean something different each time. It never does. It said, "Something followed me up from the South Ridge for 2 nights. Didn't see it clear. Don't like the way it stood. Leaving early. If anyone reads this, don't answer if it talks back in a voice you recognize. It isn't them." Nobody wrote anything after that. The station had been decommissioned the following spring, according to a stamped notice glued inside the cover. Nobody explained why. We didn't sleep on the floor that night. We sat with our backs against the same wall, watching 4 windows we couldn't cover, taking turns with the one working flashlight, listening to the wind move through gaps in the siding like something breathing through a cracked door. Around 2 in the morning, Sam's voice pitched low and familiar. My voice, Derek would say later, though to me it had sounded exactly like his. Sam went rigid beside me. He didn't answer. None of us answered. Whatever it was, called his name twice more, patient, unhurried, waiting for a response the way you wait for someone you know will eventually pick up. Then it stopped, and something began climbing the stairs. Not fast, each step landing with a deliberate, testing weight, like it wanted us to hear it coming, like the fear itself was the point before whatever came after. Derek grabbed the crowbar from the cache. Sam pressed his back so hard against the wall. I heard the old wood creak. I don't remember deciding nothing at the 2 missing treads. A long pause, then the sound of something large shifting its weight, testing the gap, unable or unwilling to cross it. For a while, nothing happened, and the nothing was worse than the climbing had been. I found myself straining to hear past my own pulse, trying to separate the wind from whatever was standing 8 feet below the trapdoor. Then it spoke, not words, not at first, just an exhale shaped like it was learning the mechanics of a human throat, a low experimental hum that rose and fell like it was testing which testing. Said it plainly, the way you'd say a name you'd known for years, and Derek's hand tightened so hard around the crowbar I heard his knuckles pop. None of us answered. Sam told me afterward that not answering was the hardest thing he'd ever done, harder than the 6 miles on a ruined ankle, harder than anything that came after, because every instinct in his body wanted to respond. We heard it breathing, slow, deep, entirely wrong in its rhythm, like something that had learned to breathe by watching us do it rather than needing to. Twice more it said a name. Mine once, and then a name none of us recognized at all, spoken with the same easy familiarity, as if it had a long list to work through and wasn't in any particular hurry to reach the end of it. When the gray light finally came through the grimy windows, the sound was gone. We didn't wait to confirm it. We got Sam up on his bad ankle, we got down the stairs on the far side of the missing treads, and we did not look back at the tower until we were 300 yards. Believe him. I also believe that whatever had climbed those stairs wanted us to see it leave on its own terms, not ours, and that the empty tower behind us was of my life, not because of the terrain, which was mercifully gentle after the ridge, but because none of us could shake the feeling of being paced. Not followed exactly, paced, the way something keeps stride with you from a distance without closing the gap, content to let you set the speed as long as it can still see you doing it. Twice, Sam swore he heard the whistle again, farther off each time, drifting further from the trail the closer we got to the trailhead lot, like whatever it belonged to understood the boundary. 4 miles ahead of schedule, and Sam's ankle held together with improvised splinting and pure stubbornness. We told the outfitter we'd had a rough trip. We didn't tell him more than that. I looked up the fire lookout's decommission records eventually, budget cuts, the official reason says, but I found a single forum post, 4 years old, from someone claiming to be a former Forest Service employee, saying the real reason was that no ranger would take the post after the last one transferred out mid-season. Neither did Derek or Sam, but sometimes, late at night, in a house 40 miles from any real wilderness, I'll hear something outside that sounds almost like footsteps, evenly spaced, unhurried, and I'll lie very still and wait for it to pass, the way you wait for something that has learned exactly how long you're willing to hold your breath. Story number 2. I worked seasonal search and rescue for 6 years before I stopped taking wilderness callouts entirely. People ask why. I usually say burnout. It's easier than the truth, which is that on my last callout, in the Ashwood Range, I found the missing hiker exactly where the coordinates said he'd be, and I still don't know what I actually, male, mid-30s, solo hiker, hadn't checked in with his emergency contact in 3 days. Last known location put him near Widow's Saddle, a notch between 2 peaks known for erratic weather and a radio dead zone that swallowed signal for almost 2 miles in every direction. My partner for the call out, a longtime volunteer named Holt, had worked that section a dozen times. He wasn't a nervous man. I want that on record because what happened to him afterward, most call-outs start. headlights carving a narrow tunnel through switchbacks while Holt ran through the logistics in his usual flat, competent way. Last cell ping. Weather window, the two most likely routes a solo hiker with the missing man's experience level would have taken off the ridge if he'd gotten into trouble. I'd worked maybe 30 call-outs with Holt by then. I'd trusted his instincts more than I trusted my own, which is part of why what happened later still doesn't sit right in my memory. Or so the old-timers at the trailhead register like to say. 3 recorded deaths in as many decades, all attributed to weather, all technically explainable. Nobody at the ranger station said much more than that when we checked in, though the woman behind the desk did ask, almost as an afterthought, whether we planned on overnighting near the saddle itself. When Holt said probably, she didn't respond. She just nodded and slid the permit across the counter. Tent still up, sleeping bag inside it, pack leaning against a boulder with food still in it. Nothing scavenged. No animal sign, which told us he hadn't been gone long when whatever happened. What struck me most, standing in that clearing, was how undisturbed everything looked. No signs of a struggle, no dragged equipment, no torn fabric, just a campsite that its owner appeared to have stepped away from and simply not returned to. The way you'd step away from a table at a restaurant. His journal was in the tent's side pocket. I read the last entries standing in that clearing while Holt radioed our position back to base, and I've never trail conditions, weather, a joke about his boots. Then 4 days before our arrival, someone else is up here. Heard them at camp last night, moving around outside. Called out. No answer. Found no tracks this morning, which doesn't make sense in this mud. The next day, they're mimicking things. Heard an owl call cut off mid-note and start again, wrong, like something learning it. Heard what sounded like my own laugh from the tree line, at a distance I couldn't have reached that fast even running. The final entry, dated 3 days before we arrived, was 4 words on the 3rd, half a mile off his last known position, in a shallow ravine that shouldn't have been hard to search, but somehow had been. Holt swore we'd walked that exact ravine twice already and seen nothing. He was alive, barely. Dehydrated, hypothermic, a wound along his forearm that looked less like a fall injury and more like something that had gripped and dragged. He wasn't coherent enough to hike out under his own power, so we set up an overnight camp to stabilize him before the usually called for. Neither of us discussed the decision out loud, we just both kept feeding it. Holt ran the radio checks with a steadiness I envied, relaying our coordinates, our patient's condition, the estimated extraction window. Between checks, he kept glancing toward the ravine wall behind us, the same stretch we'd apparently searched twice already without finding anything. Like he was doing the same math I was and not liking the answer. That was conscious until then, sat bolt upright, and started screaming a name that wasn't his own, over and over, until his voice broke into a whisper. Holt tried to calm him. The hiker grabbed Holt's wrist with a strength that didn't match his condition and said, clear as anything, "Don't let it use your voice. It's already got mine." Then, from somewhere close outside the firelight, closer than the tree line should have allowed anything to stand without us seeing it, Holt's own voice called out, "Everything okay in there?" Except Holt was sitting 3 feet. I grabbed the rifle we carried for wildlife deterrence and I didn't lower it for the rest of the night. The hiker had gone rigid at the sound, his grip tightening on my sleeve hard enough to bruise, whispering that we needed to answer for him, that if we stayed silent long enough, it would come closer to see why. We stayed silent anyway. There are instructions you follow even when you don't understand them, especially when they come from someone who has already survived 40. Always from a slightly different angle, always pitched to sound exactly like Holt, the same cadence, the same small rasp he got in his throat after a long climb. Each time, the real Holt sat rigid beside me, jaw locked, staring into the fire like looking away from it might invite something in. Holt didn't speak again until dawn. And when he did, his voice had a strange flatness to it that I initially blamed on shock. It wasn't shock, I understand that now. The extraction went smoothly, too smoothly, in hindsight. No further sounds, no further sightings, just a clean hike out with a stretcher and a rescued hiker who wouldn't speak to anyone but me, and only to say one more thing. Hike out. The way he kept a half step behind the stretcher instead of his usual position at point. The way he wouldn't meet my eyes when I tried to catch them. At the time, I chalked it up to exhaustion. We'd been awake for nearly 30 hours by then, And exhaustion does strange things to a person's manner. It's only in hindsight, replaying that walk down 100 times since, that I've started to wonder if he was watching something behind us the entire way. Something he never once mentioned. Something he decided I was better off not knowing was there. There were two of them talking outside the tent last night. One of them was you. I hadn't left that fire once. I checked with Holt afterward. Later, he wouldn't explain why beyond saying he didn't trust himself in the wilderness anymore, which at the time I took to mean nerves, fatigue, the ordinary attrition of a hard, thankless job. It's only in the years since I quietly requested a transfer myself. Since I started sleeping with a light on if I've spent any time outdoors that week, that I've wondered whether Holt meant something much more literal. Whether some nights, coming down off a mountain, you're not entirely sure which version of you actually made the walk back. I still see Holt occasionally, at reunions, at retirements. We don't talk about Ashwood, but last year, at a funeral for another old SAR volunteer, he pulled me aside and asked a single question, quiet enough that no one else could hear it. When we got back down that whole drive home, do you actually remember it, or do you just remember arriving? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Story number 3. I've never been afraid of the dark the way other people are. I grew up on a ridge with no streetlights for 11 miles, and dark, real dark, was just the shape my childhood came in. That changed the autumn. I spent 6 weeks as a fire lookout on Coldwater Peak, filling in for a seasonal hire who quit without notice halfway through the contract. I didn't ask why he quit. I wish I had. The lookout was a squat, sturdy structure, better maintained than most, with a catwalk running the perimeter and a wood stove that kept the place livable once the nights turned cold. My job was simple: watch for smoke, log weather, radio in twice a day, and otherwise be left entirely, gloriously alone. Supply runs came every 10 days by a district truck that couldn't make it past the lower trailhead, which meant a 2-mile carry each way, and I came to treasure that walk more than almost anything else about the job. The last real contact with anyone before 6 weeks. Everything I'd wanted. Silence with texture, a horizon that belonged only to me. I filled the empty hours cataloging cloud formations, learning the particular sequence in which the ridgelines lost their light each evening, teaching myself to read the distant smoke of controlled burns from real wildfire long before the district confirmed it over the radio. I felt, for the first time in years, entirely competent at something. Nights up there had a particular texture I'd grown to love before any of this started. The wood stove ticking as it cooled, the wind finding every small gap in the siding and turning each one into its own thin particular note, the cold pressing in against the windows like something patient. It's strange to say I missed that almost missed it. A sound at the edge of hearing, most nights around the same hour, somewhere below the ridge where the trees thickened into old growth. Not an animal sound, a rhythm, low and repetitive, almost like breathing scaled up to something enormous, though I told myself it was wind moving through a hollow in the rock, the kind of thing mountains do when you're alone long enough. Next radio check-in, more to hear another human voice respond than out of genuine concern. The dispatcher on duty that day, a different one than the woman I'd later speak to about the pacing on the catwalk, paused just slightly too long before answering, then asked whether the sound had a consistent timing to it. When I said it seemed to start close to dusk most nights, she said only, "That tracks," and moved on to the weather report without elaborating further. I didn't push. I've regretted that more than almost anything in life around the lookout began behaving in ways that unsettled me before I could articulate why. The pine martens that denned beneath the porch, which I'd watched come and go for 3 weeks without incident, stopped appearing entirely. A pair of ravens that had roosted in a dead snag near the catwalk for as long as I'd been there abandoned it overnight, and I never saw them again. Even the wind seemed to avoid a particular stretch of slope below the tower, the grass there standing unnaturally still while everything around it moved. By the 4th week, the sound had a direction. It moved slowly, methodically, always along the same rough arc below the lookout, as if something was pacing a boundary it had set for itself, testing the edge of it night after night. Of graph paper, the way I marked everything else up there, half out of genuine unease, half because cataloging it made it feel like something I could understand rather than something I simply had to endure. The arc held for 6 straight nights, then widened almost imperceptibly, each pass drawing a little closer to the base of the stairs than the one before. I told myself it was a large animal, an elk, or a bear working a foraging route. I kept telling myself that even after I found, at the western edge of the arc, a game trail worn into the slope that no elk or bear had made, a single track pressed into soft ground, one print only, far too long, far too deliberate, facing direct, factually the way I'd log a weather pattern. Low ambient sound, non-avian, direction, SSE, duration approx 40 minutes. Writing it down that way made it feel manageable. Science, not fear. It stopped being manageable the night the sound climbed. I woke to the catwalk, groaning under a weight it wasn't built for. Slow, deliberate steps, circling the lookout at a pace that never quickened and never slowed, 40 feet above ground with nothing but a rickety stair connecting it to solid earth. I lay in the dark with my hand around the radio, too afraid to switch on the light, too afraid to move at all, and listened to something pace my catwalk for nearly 2 hours before the steps. No scuffs in the dust that coated the catwalk boards. No disturbance in the fine grit that had gathered against the railing over 6 weeks of stillness. I checked 3 times. Whatever had walked that platform had left. No trace a person would leave. I radioed it in that morning, choosing my words carefully, framing it as a wildlife concern. The dispatcher's response was too quick, too practiced. The kind of reply that comes from someone who's fielded the exact question before. Noted. If it continues, don't investigate. Stay inside after dark. We'll flag the report. I asked what the report was for. The line went quiet, just a beat too long before she said, after I'd finished the contract and moved on to other work, that Coldwater Peak had a thin, unofficial history among fire lookout staff. Nothing in any public record, just a pattern, past lookout to lookout in the kind of conversation that never makes it into a report. Something paces the ridge in the fall. It never comes inside. It has never, as far as anyone could say for certain, heard a single person who stayed inside after dark. Really, though, God knows I wanted to. More nights than I can count. Sitting with my back against the stove with the radio volume turned up loud enough to drown my own thoughts. The pacing continued. Most nights, sometimes closer, sometimes further, and twice, only twice, it stopped directly beneath the trapdoor to the catwalk stairs and simply waited there, motionless for the better part of an hour before moving on. Both times, I sat with my back against the stove, the rifle I'd been issued for wildlife across my knees, watching the trapdoor's iron latch as if watching it hard enough could keep it closed. Both times, nothing tested the latch. It was almost worse than if something had. The waiting felt deliberate, patient in a way that suggested whatever paced my ridge wasn't her. It was simply choosing, each night, not to find out what would happen if it pushed. By the 5th week, I'd stopped sleeping in any real sense, dozing in short stretches with the radio volume turned high enough to catch static over silence. I began keeping the wood stove burning through the night regardless of temperature, less for warmth than for the small, steady sound of it, something ordinary to anchor my attention against the itch of listening for footsteps that I now recognized instantly, the way you recognize a particular morning extraction. I stepped outside onto the catwalk for one final look at a horizon I'd come to think of as mine. The pacing sound was already moving far below along its familiar arc, and then, for the only time in 6 weeks, it stopped completely, not faded, not moved off, just stopped all at once, the way a held breath stops when you finally see the thing you were listening for. I went inside. I didn't look over the railing, to admit. Usually late at night. Usually when the house is quiet enough that I start listening the way I learned to listen up there, for a rhythm below, the range of ordinary sound, patient, circling, waiting to see how long it takes before I forget to be afraid of the dark again. I haven't forgotten. Not once. And some nights, when the wind moves wrong through the trees outside my window, I find myself wondering whether they're for retired and former seasonal staff. I found myself talking to a woman who'd worked a different lookout, 2 ridges over from Coldwater, during roughly the same years I had. I mentioned the pacing, carefully, the way you test whether a stranger will think you're unwell before you commit to the rest of the story. She didn't laugh. She didn't look surprised either. She just asked very quietly whether it had ever stopped directly under my stairs and waited. Point had confirmed something she'd suspected for a long time and told me hers had done the same. 3 seasons running, always in October, always for almost exactly an hour. Neither of us had an explanation. Neither of us wanted one badly enough to go back and look for it. We agreed, without quite saying so, that some questions are better left the way the old ranger's logbook had left them, unanswered, underlined only by the fact that whoever asked them first never stayed long enough to find out.